People fear the loud threats of the powerful, but the silent footsteps of a betrayed woman are far more terrifying. That morning, I walked into family court wearing a wrinkled $20 shirt, leaving a hidden empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars outside. I simply wanted to watch arrogance turn educated elites into absolute fools. When someone digs a hole to bury you, wait for them to step inside, then quietly remove the ladder. Hello everyone, and welcome back to James' Revenge Stories. Before we begin today's tale, I want to sincerely share that YouTube has recently disabled monetization for our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Thank you so much for your kindness. My name is Alice Schmidt, and this is the story of my revenge. The heavy oak doors of the Chicago family court swung open, and the suffocating air of the room hit my face. I am 34 years old, and I walked into the most important legal battle of my life, wearing a wrinkled $20 t-shirt I had grabbed off a rack at a gas station just hours before. The fabric was stiff, the color a dull and washed-out gray. It was the perfect costume. The silence I carried with me stood in stark contrast to the obnoxious theatrical atmosphere radiating from the other side of the aisle. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was my wife, Victoria, draped in designer silk that easily cost $5,000, her posture rigid with an air of absolute superiority. Beside her sat Marcus Vance, the kind of expensive, high-powered shark who charged $1,000 an hour just to breathe the same air as his clients. He was a man who wore custom Italian suits and a perpetually smug expression. As I took my seat alone at the defense table, Marcus leaned back in his leather chair and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. He pointed a manicured finger in my direction, making sure the judge and everyone else in the gallery could hear his disdain. "Your Honor, just look at the respondent," Marcus declared, his voice dripping with venom. She cannot even bother to dress appropriately for a court of law. This $20 rag is a perfect representation of her entire existence. She is a loser, a leech, and entirely financially incompetent. My client has carried the weight of their entire household, while Miss Schmidt has contributed absolutely nothing of value. Victoria did not even look at me. She just stared straight ahead, a faint, victorious smile playing on her lips. They thought I was humiliated. They thought I was small. They had no idea that their arrogant assumptions were exactly what I was counting on. As Marcus continued his theatrical character assassination, my mind drifted away from the courtroom, traveling back exactly 2 years. It was the night the illusion of my perfect marriage shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. It started as a routine check. I was reviewing some data analytics, digging through a minor discrepancy in a newly proposed marketing plan for Victoria's tech firm. I found a hidden directory, a blind spot in the server architecture that someone thought was completely secure. It was not secure from me. Inside that directory, I did not find corporate espionage. I found hundreds of intimate emails, hotel receipts, and explicit messages exchanged between Victoria and Julian, the lead executive of our primary media partner. The betrayal was laid out in cold, hard digital ink. They had been sleeping together for over 8 months. In those messages, they did not just talk about their affair. They laughed at me. Victoria described me as her boring little mechanic, a convenient, harmless roommate who kept the router running and stayed out of her way while she conquered the business world. You see, Victoria always believed I was just a low-level systems maintenance worker, a glorified IT support girl pulling a modest salary. That was the narrative I had allowed her to believe. What my brilliant, ambitious wife did not know was that I was the anonymous genius behind the very foundation of her success. I was the sole architect who had designed the proprietary core system, the exact algorithmic engine that had skyrocketed her company's valuation to unprecedented heights. She thought she owned the empire. She did not realize she was merely renting it from me. Most people, upon discovering such devastating infidelity, would explode. They would smash plates, scream until their lungs burned, or hire a ruthless divorce attorney the very next morning to burn it all to the ground. I did none of those things. I sat in the blue light of my computer monitors and felt my heart turn into a block of absolute ice. I chose absolute silence. I realized in that moment that a loud reaction would only give her the opportunity to defend herself, to hide assets, to prepare for war. So I decided to play the exact role she had assigned to me. I became the weak, submissive, entirely clueless wife. I was setting up a much larger chess game, and the first rule of the game was to let your opponent believe they were winning. I meticulously built my cover. Over the next few weeks, I feigned a deep, emotional depression, packing my bags and moving out of our luxury penthouse. I told Victoria I needed space to find myself, walking away with nothing but 2 suitcases of cheap clothes. I left her the expensive cars, the designer furniture, and the breathtaking views of the Chicago skyline. I let her keep everything that sparkled, effectively blinding her with her own greed and lowering her guard completely. As she reveled in her shiny, stolen life, I retreated into the shadows, wearing my cheap clothes and playing the fool, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first step in dismantling an empire is finding someone who knows exactly how to legally burn it to the ground without leaving a single fingerprint. I did not go to a shiny downtown law firm with marble floors, glass walls, and associates who leak information over expensive martinis. Those places thrive on gossip. Instead, I took a grueling 2-hour bus ride to a forgotten, working-class suburb on the outer edge of the city limits. I walked into a drab, unmarked brick building situated between a failing laundromat and a discount auto parts store. The faded sign on the door simply read, "Sterling Tax Consulting." Behind a cluttered wooden desk, surrounded by towering stacks of dusty file folders, sat Eleanor Sterling. To the outside world, she was just an unassuming elderly woman doing tax returns for local bakeries and dry cleaners. In reality, Eleanor was a retired, ruthlessly brilliant corporate attorney. Decades ago, she used to tear Fortune 500 companies apart in the courtroom before she grew disgusted with the corporate spotlight and chose a life of total obscurity. "I need to completely disappear on paper, Eleanor," I told her, sitting in a worn fabric chair that smelled faintly of old coffee and stale paper. "And I need to take my intellectual property with me. Every single line of code, every patent, every algorithm." Eleanor stopped typing on her ancient computer, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, and looked down at the encrypted flash drive I had placed on her desk. "If this data is what I think it is, you are not just leaving a marriage. You are pulling the concrete foundation out from under a 90-story skyscraper. I want them to feel the collapse before they even see the cracks forming," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. She studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, she smiled. It was a sharp, predatory grin. "Let us get to work." For the next 6 months, Eleanor and I engaged in an absolute masterclass of legal and financial obfuscation. It was a cold, highly calculated operation, executed with the unyielding precision of a seasoned surgeon. The core algorithm that powered Victoria's tech company, the exact beating heart of her massive valuation, belonged entirely to me. I had filed the original utility and design patents years ago under a complex labyrinth of initial limited liability companies that Victoria never bothered to understand. She was always too busy doing magazine interviews and attending high-profile charity galas to read the technical fine print. Working late into the night, operating out of Eleanor's cramped office, we methodically restructured those patents. We initiated a complex series of blind transfers. We moved the intellectual property rights across international borders, laundering the ownership through a dozen different ghost entities in tax havens that did not require public disclosure of executives. Finally, we parked everything in an impenetrable legal fortress. We named this massive holding corporation Aegis Core Systems. On paper, Aegis Core Systems was a faceless titan, a foreign tech conglomerate with zero direct ties to a seemingly insignificant, unemployed woman living in Chicago. By the time Eleanor filed the final piece of paperwork, Victoria's company was officially operating on borrowed time. They were now using my proprietary software illegally, accumulating massive copyright infringement liabilities every single second their servers were running, and they were completely, blissfully oblivious to the ticking time bomb beneath their feet. But hiding the assets was only half of the battle. I needed to forge a bulletproof narrative of my own pathetic failure. A sudden disappearance of wealth would raise red flags with any competent auditor. A slow, miserable descent into poverty, however, would not. Therefore, I needed an airtight alibi for my daily existence. I actively searched for the lowest-paying job I could find and applied for a night-shift data entry position at Apex Data Solutions. It was a tiny, struggling logistics firm that operated out of a dreary, poorly lit office park. The pay was a miserable $35,000 a year. It was the kind of mind-numbing job that actively crushes your soul, requiring me to manually input shipping manifests into outdated software for 8 straight hours, from midnight until 8 in the morning. My new manager was a balding, perpetually stressed man who constantly reminded me how incredibly lucky I was to receive basic medical benefits. I would just nod, smile meekly, and type away on a cheap plastic keyboard that constantly stuck on the spacebar. It was an agonizing, humiliating charade, but an absolutely necessary one. This paltry income became the structural cornerstone of my manufactured identity. It perfectly legitimized the narrative that Victoria and her high-priced lawyers wanted so desperately to believe. With my fake career firmly established, I needed a proper stage for my supposed misery. I scoured the worst neighborhoods and rented a shabby, damp basement apartment in an industrial zone right on the edge of the active train tracks. Every time a massive freight train rolled by at 3 in the morning, the cheap drywall would vibrate violently, and gray dust would fall from the ceiling onto my bed. The air in that apartment smelled perpetually of deep mildew and heavy diesel exhaust. There was only a single tiny window, barred with rusty iron, that looked out onto a dark alley filled with overflowing restaurant dumpsters. However, the physical decay was strictly superficial. While the main living room held nothing but a lumpy thrift store mattress and a broken television with static, the secondary storage room hidden behind a locked false wall was a completely different story. I transformed that cramped, windowless space into my own high-tech secret command center. The ventilation unit was heavily modified to keep the room temperature constantly at a cool 65 degrees. 6 ultra-high-definition monitors glowed in the darkness, all connected to a heavily encrypted, custom-built server rack that I had assembled piece by piece. From this hidden subterranean bunker, I hacked legally into my own systems, bypassing the rudimentary security protocols I had intentionally left in Victoria's network. I monitored every single financial transaction, every confidential internal email, and every strategic business move her company made in real time. I sat in the dark and watched her empire function on a daily basis, knowing with absolute certainty that I held the detonator in my hand. To complete the grand illusion, my financial footprint had to be impeccably flawless in its pure mediocrity. Eleanor helped me open checking accounts at obscure local credit unions that only ever saw deposits of my pathetic Apex Data Solutions paychecks. I applied for 2 standard credit cards with a maximum limit of $1,000 each. I used them strictly for buying cheap groceries, regular unleaded gas, and paying basic electricity bills. I always made sure to pay only the minimum balance each month to ensure my credit score remained completely average and unimpressive. Every single tax document, every utility bill, every grocery store receipt painted a vivid, easily verifiable picture of a woman barely surviving on the absolute edge of financial ruin. There were no hidden offshore accounts under my name. There were no secret trust funds or crypto wallets for any private investigator to discover. I was, by all legal definitions and public records, a complete and utter financial failure. I built this cage of poverty so meticulously, and with such overwhelming transparency, that it became the perfect bait. I constructed a flawless, irrefutable narrative of extreme weakness, laying it out like a welcoming red carpet, waiting patiently for my arrogant prey to stroll right into the trap. While I spent my nights breathing in the damp air of a subterranean basement, Victoria was busy breathing the rarefied air of the absolute elite. Her face began appearing with sickening regularity on the glossy covers of premier business magazines. She was branded as a visionary, a trailblazer, an unstoppable force in the tech sector. I would walk past newsstands and see her perfectly contoured smile beaming back at me, accompanied by headlines praising her unparalleled genius. Victoria would give interviews to prominent journalists, wearing clothes that cost more than my annual fabricated salary, speaking eloquently about the burdens of being a solitary innovator. She claimed she built the core software from scratch during sleepless nights, blatantly stealing my history and wearing it as her own personal badge of honor. Beside her in these features, often cast as her brilliant legal strategist, was Marcus Vance. They fed off each other's egos in a grotesque display of corporate narcissism. They truly believed they were the untouchable architects of a new digital era, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were merely dancing on a stage I had constructed. Their arrogance soon mutated into something far more sinister than simple vanity. They decided to go after full legal custody of Mia. Mia is our 12-year-old adopted daughter, a quiet, deeply observant girl who had always preferred reading in a quiet corner to attending Victoria's lavish dinner parties. Victoria did not want Mia because she loved her. Maternal affection was a completely foreign concept to a woman whose heart pumped cold ambition instead of blood. No, Victoria wanted Mia for the exact same reason she wanted a corner office. It was purely about optical leverage. A messy divorce with a lost custody battle would tarnish her perfectly curated brand. Investors loved a strong, independent mother successfully balancing a billion-dollar company and a happy home. To Victoria, a 12-year-old child was not a human being. She was simply a highly effective public relations asset. She hired a team of expensive social media managers just to post carefully staged photographs of her and Mia baking cookies on Sunday afternoons. It made my stomach turn to see my sweet daughter forced to smile for the cameras, treated like a shiny accessory by a woman who rarely bothered to ask how her school day went. To ensure this flawless victory, Marcus Vance launched a campaign of psychological warfare against my legal counsel. From his high-rise office, he fired off a relentless barrage of emails to Eleanor Sterling, treating her like an incompetent amateur. I read every single one of those emails. His settlement offers were incredibly insulting. He proposed a one-time payout of $5,000 and the title to a severely rusted 10-year-old sedan, demanding in return that I completely surrender all parental rights and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Tell your pathetic client to take the pennies and disappear into whatever hole she crawled out of, Marcus wrote in one particularly venomous dispatch. If she even attempts to fight this in court, I will personally ensure she is publicly humiliated. I will drag her non-existent career through the mud, expose her as an unstable, negligent parasite, and leave her with legal fees she could not pay off in 3 lifetimes. Do not test me, Eleanor. I ruin people for sport. Eleanor would simply forward these threats to my encrypted server without a single word of commentary. We both knew Marcus was digging a grave so deep he would never be able to climb out. He was completely intoxicated by his own reputation. He thought he was intimidating a helpless victim. He did not know I was sitting in my dark bunker, watching his every keystroke. Through the backdoor access I maintained on Victoria's personal devices and the company's internal networks, I had a front-row seat to their private cruelty. I monitored a hidden group chat shared exclusively by Victoria and Julian, her media executive lover. Late at night, while they drank expensive wine in the penthouse I used to call home, they would entertain themselves by mocking my carefully crafted misery. I watched the text bubbles pop up on my screen. Julian would joke about my wrinkled clothes, asking if I had started shopping out of charity bins. "She is probably eating canned soup in a gutter by now," Julian typed one evening. "You really carried dead weight for a decade." Victoria replied instantly. She served her purpose. Now she is just a slight administrative annoyance. Marcus will squash her like a bug by Tuesday. I bet she smells like industrial bleach and failure. She even sent him a secretly taken photograph of me walking in the rain toward my rusted car, captioning it with a cruel remark about how easily the weak can be discarded. They were having the time of their lives. I felt absolutely nothing. No tears, no rage. Just the cold, mechanical precision of a predator observing its prey. With every keystroke, I archived their mockery. I downloaded every single message, every time-stamped photo, and every voice note. More importantly, I intercepted the heavily doctored financial reports Victoria was preparing for her upcoming board meeting. She was artificially inflating her revenue projections by nearly 40% to secure a new round of funding. A blatant act of corporate fraud that would carry severe federal penalties. I cataloged the fake spreadsheets right alongside the messages where they mocked my cheap shoes. I compiled a digital dossier of their hubris, meticulously indexing every lie, every affair, and every fraudulent number. I did not need to forge a weapon to destroy them. I simply needed to gather the weapons they were foolishly handing to me. They were entirely blinded by their own bloated self-importance, convinced that their wealth made them invincible. As I sat in the glow of my monitors, listening to the distant rumble of the freight trains, I understood a fundamental truth. The sharpest blade in the world cannot cut a person as deeply as their own unchecked complacency. The night before the final hearing, the air in my basement apartment felt unusually still, heavy with the weight of the impending storm. I stood by a wobbly wooden table under the harsh glare of a single flickering fluorescent bulb. I was carefully running a cheap iron over the fabric of a faded gray t-shirt. I had paid exactly $20 for it over a decade ago. To Victoria and her high-priced lawyer, it was just a pathetic rag, a symbol of my manufactured poverty and incompetence. But to me, it held a profound, almost sacred weight. This was not a random piece of clothing. It was a relic. This was the exact shirt I wore during those endless, grueling nights in our first cramped studio apartment, back when Victoria possessed nothing but raw ambition, a silver tongue, and an empty bank account. I had practically lived in this cheap cotton fabric, staying awake for 48 hours at a time, typing furiously on a second-hand laptop to write the foundational code that would eventually become her billion-dollar empire. My sweat, my absolute exhaustion, and my silent, unwavering devotion were woven into every single frayed thread. Ironing it felt less like a chore and more like preparing my armor for the final battle. The profound silence of the room was abruptly broken by the sharp, piercing ring of my encrypted burner phone. The digital clock on the wall read exactly midnight. I picked up the receiver to hear the calm, gravelly, and endlessly reassuring voice of Eleanor Sterling. "It is done, Alice," she said softly, but with a sharp edge of finality. "Every single financial snare we set has officially snapped shut. The international asset transfers are locked tight behind layers of corporate veils. But more importantly, the entire unredacted dossier outlining their massive corporate fraud, the falsified revenue reports, and the blatant copyright infringement was placed directly onto the judge's desk at exactly 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The trap is sprung. They are walking into a sealed tomb tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I disconnected the call and placed the phone down. The massive chessboard I had spent 2 years designing was now locked in place. There were absolutely no more moves to make in the shadows. I sat on the edge of my lumpy mattress, staring at a small, crumpled photograph of Mia that I kept hidden in my pocket. My mind drifted back to our brief, court-mandated supervised visitation just 2 days prior. Victoria had sent Mia to the dreary county visitation center dressed in a ridiculous designer wool coat that easily cost over $2,000, accompanied by a stern-faced, highly paid nanny. Victoria had desperately hoped that the stark visual contrast between my damp, depressing surroundings and Mia's luxurious lifestyle would finally break the tender bond between us. She wanted Mia to look at my cheap shoes and my tired eyes with pity, or better yet, pure disgust. But children possess a pure, uncorrupted intuition that immense wealth cannot manipulate. When Mia walked into that sterile, awful room, she completely ignored the cheap plastic toys and the depressing gray walls. She ran straight into my arms, burying her face deep into my worn-out sweater. She hugged her supposedly impoverished, failed mother with a desperate, fierce strength that brought tears to my eyes. "I do not care about the big house, Mom," she had whispered into my shoulder, her small voice trembling. "I just want you to come home with me." In that fleeting, beautiful moment, holding my daughter tightly against my chest, I found the absolute justification for everything I had orchestrated. Love, true and unconditional love, could never be bought with stolen corporate funds or shiny distractions. I was going to tear down an entire empire just to ensure she grew up in the light of the truth. A profound, heavy peace settled over my soul. I did not feel the erratic, burning, desperate desire for revenge that usually consumes betrayed people. I maintained a psychological state as solid and immovable as a mountain. I did not need to win in the eyes of those who had deceived me. I did not crave a tearful apology from Victoria, nor did I need Marcus Vance to suddenly respect me. My only objective was to drag the unvarnished, undeniable truth out of the darkness and into the blinding light of day. The storm was finally coming, and I was the quiet, immovable eye at its exact center. The next morning, I arrived at the massive family court building exactly 1 hour before the heavy glass doors officially opened. I wanted to be the very first person in that room. When the bailiff finally let us in, I immediately chose a seat in the darkest, most isolated corner of the defense table. I intentionally slouched my shoulders forward, pulled my arms tightly inward, and lowered my gaze to stare at the scuffed wooden floor. I deliberately crafted a physical posture of total defeat, projecting the exact body language of a broken, terrified, and thoroughly beaten underdog. I made myself look as small and insignificant as humanly possible, perfectly paving the runway for the magnificent, arrogant performance I knew Marcus Vance was incredibly eager to deliver. The heavy oak doors were closed. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the rhythmic, confident tapping of Marcus Vance's custom Italian leather shoes against the polished hardwood floor. He was in his element, pacing back and forth in front of the judge's bench like a theatrical predator. He held a thick stack of documents in his left hand, waving them in the air to punctuate his venomous monologue. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice echoing with practiced indignation, "we are here today to finalize the severing of a deeply parasitic attachment. My client, Victoria, has spent the last decade building a technological powerhouse, carrying the immense burden of an entire corporate enterprise on her shoulders. And what has the respondent contributed? Absolutely nothing." He slammed a folder onto the table right in front of me. "I submit to the court Exhibit A. These are bank statements. They clearly show a consistent, undeniable pattern of financial incompetence and blatant gold-digging behavior. Miss Schmidt has deliberately remained unemployed or underemployed for years. She has manipulated my client's generosity, draining resources while refusing to build a career of her own. She is completely unfit to claim any portion of my client's hard-earned assets. And she is certainly entirely unfit to be granted even partial custody of their 12-year-old daughter. To place a child in the care of someone so utterly devoid of ambition, responsibility, and basic financial independence would be a tragic miscarriage of justice." Marcus paused, letting his harsh words hang in the heavy air of the courtroom. He turned to look at me, a cruel, triumphant sneer plastered across his face. He expected me to shrink, to cry, or to burst into an undignified fit of rage. I did none of those things. I simply kept my hands folded neatly on my lap, staring blankly ahead, maintaining the perfect illusion of a defeated woman. Victoria sat beside him, radiating pure arrogance. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white suit, her arms crossed tight, nodding in agreement with every derogatory word her lawyer spat in my direction. She looked at me not with hatred, but with absolute pity. That pity was the final nail in her own coffin. "Are you quite finished, Counselor?" Judge Harrison asked. His voice was unusually flat, completely devoid of the usual judicial impatience. Marcus puffed out his chest, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor. The defense rests its case on the overwhelming evidence of the respondent's complete financial and personal inadequacy. The judge did not look at Marcus. He did not look at Victoria. He looked directly at me. His eyes briefly flicked down to a massive, heavily sealed manila envelope sitting dead center on his mahogany desk. It was the federal dossier Eleanor had personally delivered the previous afternoon. Before I rule on any motions regarding custody or asset division, the judge stated, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor, there is a matter of profound legal magnitude that has been brought to the immediate attention of this court. A matter that completely supersedes these standard divorce proceedings. Marcus frowned, his perfect posture faltering for a fraction of a second. Your Honor, I am not aware of any superseding filings. That is because you are not the target of the investigation, Mr. Vance, the judge replied coldly. He picked up his reading glasses, slid them onto the bridge of his nose, and looked at me again. Miss Schmidt, I need you to stand up and state your full legal name and your current professional title for the official court record. And please, speak clearly into the microphone. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Marcus let out a short, dismissive scoff, clearly thinking this was a mere procedural formality. Victoria rolled her eyes, adjusting her diamond watch. I took a slow, deep breath. I unclasped my hands. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not slouch anymore. I pulled my shoulders back, straightened my spine, and lifted my chin. I looked directly into Victoria's eyes, watching the exact moment her condescending smile began to freeze. I leaned toward the microphone. My voice was calm, clear, and absolutely steady. My name is Alice Schmidt. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole owner of Aegis Core Systems. For 3 entire seconds, there was absolutely no sound in the room. The name of the holding company hung in the air like a suspended executioner's blade. Then, the judge broke the seal on the thick envelope. He pulled out a massive stack of federal documents bearing the official crest of the United States Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The court has received an emergency federal injunction, Judge Harrison announced, his voice booming through the silent room. This dossier contains irrefutable, deeply documented proof that the core software currently operating the entirety of your client's technology firm, Victoria, was never legally hers to begin with. The foundational patents were legally transferred to Aegis Core Systems over 6 months ago. By continuing to use and monetize this proprietary code without authorization, your client's company has committed gross copyright infringement on an international scale. Furthermore, this document includes unredacted internal communications and falsified revenue reports, proving your client artificially inflated corporate valuations to secure funding. According to this federal filing, Victoria's company currently owes Aegis Core Systems tens of millions of dollars in immediate, unmitigated restitution. The color drained from Victoria's face so fast she looked like a ghost. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the polished wooden table so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. "That is impossible," she stammered, her voice cracking, completely losing her polished corporate persona. "Aegis is a foreign conglomerate. She is just a data entry clerk. She makes $35,000 a year. I made exactly what I needed to make to ensure you felt completely secure while I dismantled your life, Victoria," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the room with terrifying clarity. Marcus Vance went into immediate panic mode. His survival instincts kicked in, and he desperately tried to salvage his sinking ship. "Your Honor, this is a complete fabrication. This is an absurd, elaborate lie constructed by a desperate woman trying to steal my client's hard-earned success. I will have my firm tear these ridiculous documents apart. I will deploy a dozen attorneys." "You will not deploy anyone, Mr. Vance," I interrupted him. My voice was no longer quiet. It was the sharp, unyielding tone of an absolute sovereign. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tight with fury. "Excuse me?" I turned my body to face him directly. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive suit and his arrogant sneer. "I highly suggest you check your personal email, Mr. Vance. Specifically, the internal corporate restructuring memo that was dispatched to all senior partners exactly 3.5 hours ago." Marcus blinked, totally disoriented. He instinctively reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen and opened his inbox. "While you were busy drafting insulting emails to my legal counsel and preparing fake bank statements," I continued, savoring every single syllable, "I was busy liquidating a fraction of the assets hidden within Aegis Core Systems. I used those funds to aggressively purchase shares in your prestigious legal firm through a series of anonymous proxy buyers. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the final transaction cleared. Aegis Core Systems officially acquired a 51% controlling stake in your firm." I took a step out from behind the defense table, closing the physical distance between us. "You are not going to tear my documents apart, Marcus. You are not going to ruin me for sport, because as of 8 o'clock this morning, I am your majority shareholder. I am your boss, and you are currently billing $1,000 an hour to hurl baseless, defamatory insults at the person who literally owns the chair you are sitting in." The psychological blow was completely devastating. Marcus Vance, the untouchable shark of the Chicago legal world, physically stumbled backward. The thick stack of fraudulent bank statements he had been waving around so proudly slipped from his trembling fingers. The papers scattered across the polished hardwood floor like dead leaves in a sudden winter storm. His face turned a sickly, ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to salvage some shred of his shattered ego, but absolutely no words came out. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic magnitude of his own defeat. To his right, Victoria completely collapsed. Her knees gave out and she slumped heavily into her chair, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized her chest. She looked at the judge, then at Marcus, and finally at me. The horrifying reality was crashing down on her all at once. Her bank accounts, her stock options, her pristine public image, her entire fabricated empire. All of it was being frozen by federal authorities at this exact moment. She had absolutely nothing left. The wealth she had used to shield her infidelity and her cruelty had been completely vaporized. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward to maintain order as Victoria began to hyperventilate loudly, sobbing hysterically into her hands. Marcus stood completely frozen, staring blankly at his phone screen, a broken man trapped in a prison of his own extreme arrogance. Amidst the total devastation, the frantic weeping, and the sound of $1 billion empire crumbling into absolute dust, I remained perfectly, utterly still. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I just stood there in the center of the room. The faded gray fabric of my $20 t-shirt rested lightly against my shoulders. It was wrinkled, cheap, and entirely unimpressive. But in that breathtaking moment of ultimate victory, as I looked down at the people who had tried to bury me alive, that cheap cotton shirt felt as heavy, as commanding, and as utterly magnificent as the royal cape of a king who had just reclaimed his stolen throne. Judge Harrison banged his wooden gavel, the sharp sound echoing like a final judgment across the stunned room. He did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or legal formalities. Given the unprecedented conflict of interest and the undeniable evidence of gross professional misconduct, he immediately stripped Marcus Vance of all legal standing in the case. The judge then officially granted me full, absolute, and uncontested custody of my daughter Mia. But the judicial hammer did not stop there. Judge Harrison sternly announced that he was forwarding Victoria's entire unredacted financial dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was now officially under federal investigation for severe investor fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. Marcus Vance, the terrifying shark who had built a lucrative career out of crushing the defenseless, was completely broken. He slowly bent down, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grasp the scattered, useless documents on the floor. He shoved the crumpled papers into his expensive Italian leather briefcase. His shoulders were slumped, his posture utterly defeated. As he turned and walked toward the heavy oak courtroom doors, his trademark arrogant stride had completely vanished. He did not dare to lift his heavy head. He did not look at me for even a single second. His career, his fearsome reputation, and his massive ego were left dead on that polished hardwood floor. I quietly gathered my things and walked out of the courtroom. Out in the grand marble hallway, the final, pathetic act of Victoria's tragedy unfolded. She had chased after me, her designer heels clicking frantically against the stone floor. As I turned, she completely collapsed to her knees right in front of me, sobbing uncontrollably. She desperately grabbed the hem of my cheap, wrinkled t-shirt, heavy tears ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. "Alice, please," she begged, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated desperation. "Please do not do this to me. I have lost everything. Julian left the moment the accounts were frozen. I have absolutely nothing. Please forgive me." I looked down at the woman I had once loved, the woman who had mocked my devotion and stolen my genius. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a profound emptiness. I gently reached down, peeled her desperate, shaking fingers off my clothing, and brushed her hand away. "Your arrogance was far more expensive than you ever thought, Victoria," I said quietly. I turned my back and walked away, leaving her weeping bitterly alone on the cold marble floor, her cries echoing through the empty corridor. I stepped out through the massive glass doors of the courthouse, and the bright, warm Chicago sunlight immediately washed over my face. There were no flashing cameras waiting for me. There were no luxury supercars idling at the curb, and there was absolutely no expensive champagne poured to celebrate my monumental victory. I did not need any of those empty things. Standing quietly by the curb, waiting patiently next to my rusted 10-year-old sedan, was Mia. When she saw me walking down the steps, her face lit up with the brightest, most beautiful smile I had ever seen. I walked over, opened the creaky car door, and as she happily climbed into the passenger seat, the small old vehicle felt absolutely overflowing with pure, undeniable peace. True strength does not reside in designer labels, expensive watches, or the loud, obnoxious threats of those who falsely believe they hold all the power. True strength lies in the quiet, unyielding patience of working diligently in the shadows. You see, the truth never actually needs anyone to scream on its behalf. It simply needs the exact right moment to step out into the light and prove itself. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's story compelling, please consider helping us out with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the description or the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows our dedicated team to pay their bills, feed their families, and continue creating more great stories for you. Thank you, and take care.